All right. Lesson for this week be a little bit shorter than some of the other ones. Um, but the lesson for this week is the second New Deal, and I hope everybody's doing well. But particularly, I want to look at some of the shortcomings for the people in the New Deal, and also I want to look at some of the controversial aspects, one in particular of the New Deal during the second New Deal. So, like I implied when I just opened, the New Deal is often broken into two phases: a first New Deal and a second New Deal. And the reason for this is really because the first New Deal doesn't solve the problem; it helps, but it doesn't solve the problem. And as you can see by looking at this graph of unemployment, it gives you a kind of a feel for what I'm talking about. You can see in the green before FDR's presidency, or right at the beginning of his presidency, unemployment spiked. And then after the New Deal creates the work programs and these types of things like the CCC and various forms of relief for the people, you can see that unemployment it plummets back down from almost 25% down to below 15%. However, you can see there's another little spike, and what happened was at the end of Roosevelt's first term, right around the end of his first term, Roosevelt ended a lot of the work programs, and it resulted in a spike in unemployment, and it caused Roosevelt to turn around and create some new programs and also some important social safety net programs like Social Security and old age pensions and these types of things. And so the second New Deal is taken because of this little spike that you see in the green area, in the pink there, this kind of almost like mini depression within a depression that happens was the cause for the second New Deal. Now, one of the really key components, of course, about the second New Deal was relief, and most significantly in the form of Social Security. Social Security was designed basically as an old age pension. It also included things like unemployment relief, dependent children relief, but most specifically an old age pension. And the idea, obviously, behind it, as I'm sure you guys know, is you pay a certain percentage of your paycheck, and theoretically it goes into a Social Security fund, basically. There are some issues with the sustainability of Social Security today, but it certainly does not have to be unsustainable. Social Security can absolutely be a sustainable program for the future, and as we move forward as citizens in this country, we need to find a way, I think, to make Social Security sustainable rather than to allow it to become completely insolvent, because Social Security was created as the advertisement from the Social Security Board, is suggesting. It was created for a very legitimate and noble purpose, and one that I think most Americans would agree that there is a responsibility of their government to assure that people, particularly older people who can no longer work, that they have a pension that they can live on. Poverty amongst the elderly in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, and it continues after the New Deal particularly, but poverty for the elderly was a huge issue. And Social Security was designed to deal with this. Now, unfortunately, in the New Deal, you'll find that everything is not fair to all workers, and there's a lot of reasons for this, but one particular reason is that there's a lot of racism in American society. And so Social Security was not fair for all workers, and in particular, it wasn't fair for African Americans, and it also wasn't fair for Mexican workers, because farm laboring, like sharecropping and things like this, was generally left off of the the programs that contributed to the Social Security programs, and therefore African Americans and Mexican Americans were generally left without old age pensions. They were left without the unemployment programs and these types of things. And the consequence of this is that when a sharecropper who doesn't make much money, sharecroppers lived in perpetual debt. Sharecropping in the South was virtual slavery, and so when an old sharecropper could no longer work anymore and is in a situation in which they had to receive an old age pension, then that help that they would receive was then labeled as welfare. And the reason for this was because, particularly of Southern influence in politics, some of the most astute progressives were Southerners, and Southerners that in some cases were very racist and had an agenda to keep down African Americans in the South. And so they fought to keep sharecropping labor off, for example, of the Social Security old age pension programs. Southern politicians, I might have said progressives, but actually the New Deal is, in a lot of respects, a carryover from progressive ideas. The idea of unemployment, of old age pension, and these types of things, they actually were holdovers from the progressive era. And things like Social Security were actually promoted in the election of 1912. However, another carryover of the progressive era is that there are people who would consider themselves progressives, or during the New Deal would consider themselves New Dealers, if you will, but could also be very racist. And this was particularly predominant in the South, in which you had, New Deal politicians who, fought for some of these changes, but at the same time also were very racist and fought for programs that would allow them to control African Americans and control the status quo in the South. And so African Americans largely went without the opportunity to contribute to these programs. And it was from these roots that you find the racially developed idea of welfare, that the people who were receiving these old age pensions had not paid for it, and so they were somehow receiving a handout. They were receiving something they hadn't worked for. And so all the way back into the 1930s, you see that people create, largely because of racism in the United States, they create a racial component to the idea of receiving welfare. And of course, all of it, none of it had to do with the right or wrong of a poor sharecropper. It was about a racist status quo, enforcing that status quo. Another example, too, by the way, if any of you guys ever heard of residential segregation, residential segregation was fundamentally imbued in the New Deal as well. The home relief programs were actually designed and wrote up contracts in which neighborhoods were residentially segregated. And there, even in Texas, you had Mexican segregated, African American segregated, and white segregated neighborhoods. And they drew up these home relief programs on the basis of the racial status of the individuals who would be receiving them. And so that led to the development of residential segregation, particularly in the post-war period, and that was a huge problem in the United States, and it still is a huge problem in the United States. There's a reason why, if you look at demographic maps, there's a reason why the maps in many cases, different types of people, different groups of people seem segregated, because the country actively and consciously did residential segregation, and it went all the way back to the New Deal. One of the elements, and I've already showed you this, but I'm going to show it again. One of the elements of recovery during the second New Deal was the creation of the WPA. And the WPA employed, it was sort of like the PWA, but they employed some 3 million Americans, and there were adult education programs, there were WPA teachers, they built stadiums, they built theaters, They were a really significant part of the Second New Deal. The Tennessee Valley Authority, which is sort of part of the Second New Deal, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which continues, was founded in 1933, and the TVA was designed to build dams on the Tennessee River, to distribute cheap energy to a very poor community. It went to 7 different states, received energy from TVA dams, and it was also designed to get a greater understanding of price gouging. This is kind of review. We've already mentioned this in the last presentation, but this is the only slide that falls into that category. So during the Second New Deal, and I'm kind of highlighting some of the more negative components of the New Deal in this particular presentation. During the Second New Deal, FDR saw some of his key programs unconstitutional. Like I said in the last presentation, the NRA was found unconstitutional, and the National Recovery Administration was for FDR integral because it was about finding a way to put Americans back to work, and that really was the heart of the New Deal, is putting Americans back to work. But after things like the AAA and of course the NRA were found unconstitutional, FDR and by the way, Social Security went before the courts too, and the courts found Social Security constitutional, of course. But FDR, after the failure with the NRA, FDR went to great lengths to try to meddle with the Supreme Court, and this brought tremendous criticism to him. The Supreme Court, for anybody who's not aware, today is 9 justices in the Supreme Court, going back to the precedents established by John Marshall, who was really the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Marshall's precedents established the Supreme Court has the right to judicial review. Of course, that's the finding of the famous Marbury versus Madison decision at the beginning of the 19th century. And what that means is that the Supreme Court, I'm sure you guys know, has the right to hear cases on the basis of constitutionality. While it may be the case that the courts are supposed to hear these cases objectively, and they do, I believe, but nonetheless, Supreme Court justices have different ways of interpreting things and different perspectives. You can have a conservative justice, and a conservative justice might be more likely to interpret the Constitution very rigidly, very literally, meaning that what the Constitution doesn't explicitly say you can do, you can't do it. But you can also have more liberal-minded justices, and a more liberal-minded justice typically believes in the power of implied clauses, that there are interpretive elements to the Constitution that can create a broader spectrum of things that may or may not be constitutional. That's kind of a simplistic breakdown of the difference between a conservative justice and a liberal justice, but because certainly a conservative justice interprets implied clauses too. But nonetheless, the idea is that courts can be conservative and courts can be liberal. And the conservative justice versus the liberal justice will find their findings will be different. Well, the Supreme Court in the 1930s was an older and a conservative court. It was by and large packed with the nominations of Warren G. Harding. Harding had appointed 4 Supreme Court justices, which is a very high number of justices for any president to appoint. I'm pretty sure it was 4, but it was a lot, comparatively. And FDR saw these justices as an impediment to the New Deal. They were finding unconstitutional things that he felt were really critical for reform in the United States. And so the solution that FDR developed was to basically, first he tried to create effectively an age requirement to make older justices resign. That fails. He tried to expand the number of justices from 9 to 13. Obviously, that failed too. Roosevelt received tremendous criticism from Democrats and Republicans alike over this, and it was really a big political mistake in the short term. Of course, in the long term, it wasn't, because, of course, Roosevelt will win a third term, and then he'll win a fourth term. So, obviously, it was a limited short-term mistake, but nonetheless, a controversial period in the New Deal. I also want to mention, women in the New Deal. Women, and this is positive. You'll see where I'm going with this, but women, I would say the leader for women in the New Deal was Eleanor Roosevelt, who, of course, was Franklin Roosevelt's wife, distant cousin, but wife. And she was really, she's really the original First Lady. She was an advocate. She spoke. She mobilized people. She built support for important issues in the country. She wrote a weekly column. She was very much on the forefront of addressing issues of class or labor, race, and gender inequalities in the country. One of her great triumphs, I think, as First Lady and as an individual who was really fighting for greater equality in the country, was when she was organized the jazz singer Marian Anderson's performance at the Lincoln Memorial in 1939. Anderson was supposed to perform for the Daughters of the American Revolution at Constitutional Hall, and the Daughters of the Revolution refused because she was African American. And that's when Eleanor Roosevelt organized the concert in front of the Lincoln Memorial as a fitting symbol to what needed to be a promise for greater equality in America. However, nonetheless, despite the pressure placed by individuals like Eleanor Roosevelt or African American women like Mary McLeod Bethune, nonetheless, during the New Deal, women were placed. There was great pressure placed on women to remove themselves from the workplace, to be domestic. And in the late 30s, it was a bit of a blow to the feminist movement. There were cases in which, for example, there were laws passed in which the law specifically said that a household could only have one person working for the federal relief programs. And that resulted in cases of women being forced to give up their jobs for their husband's job. And so that's one example. But in a lot of respects, women were viewed as taking away jobs from men, and they were encouraged largely to remove themselves from the workplace and to sort of be domestic. So by no means was the New Deal fair for women laborers. And of course, women laborers, particularly African-American women laborers, were the least likely to receive the benefits of old age pensions and things like Social Security. In fact, 85% of African-American women could not receive or were not paying into old age pension programs. Minorities in the New Deal, and this is the last slide. In a lot of respects, the New Deal failed for minorities in this country. There was so-called the Indian New Deal, and these were important changes in which the United States finally recognized that things like the Carlisle School were wrong. The Carlisle School was a program of re-education for Native American children, forced re-education. And so, during the New Deal, things like the Carlisle School were done away with. But on the flip side of things, you still had issues like the building of the Grand Coulee Dam, for example, in which they built the dam with a complete disconcern for the traditional hunting lands of Native Americans and the fisheries and these types of things. Mexican Americans who worked largely in the fields of California and in Texas largely ignored. African Americans. Now, Mary McLeod Bethune was appointed the African American. She was a teacher, and she was appointed to the head of the Minority Affairs Board. But nonetheless, the powerful Southern veto, Southern politics, which fought the passage of anti-lynching laws and promoted segregated work camps and residential segregation, these types of things meant that much of the promise of the New Deal was not extended to African Americans. A majority of them were working in jobs that didn't contribute to Social Security benefits. They were denied a minimum wage. One of the contributions of the New Deal was to push for minimum wage. One of the things of the Wagner Act, for example, was minimum wage for manufacturing industry, but the type of work that was done by Mexican Americans or African Americans was denied minimum wage standards. But nonetheless, it's important to note that African Americans saw that the Democrats, particularly Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Northern Democrats in particular, were making efforts to improve civil rights. And for this reason, you see a massive shift in African Americans voting. African Americans during this time, by and large, become Democrats. They move away from the party of Lincoln and the Republican Party, and they become Democrats. And of course, that's partially because of the experience of, Herbert Hoover and the Republicans in the 20s. The Republicans in the 30s and the 20s and 30s did not promote these types of New Deal programs with nearly the kind of drive that FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt did. And the work of Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt was hugely significant in this huge demographic voting shift.